We are officially recording. So before we officially introduce the panelists, we'd like to know a little bit more about the attendees. So if you could participate in this poll, I know you introduce yourselves in the chat, but it can be helpful for us to kind of visualize the distribution of who is an advocate, who's a mental health provider, just so we can try to tailor the information a little bit more to your specific role in the community. So I'll give about 30 more seconds for people to submit their votes, and all of the votes are anonymous, and you can select more than one. Oh, I see in the chat there's some that are not described on the poll. There's board certified dance movement therapist, welcome. A volunteer youth leader, welcome. Thank you for being here. All right, so it's officially been a minute, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results with everyone. So it looks like about 41% of the webinar attendees are social service providers, so social worker, case manager, something of the sort. 33% are domestic violence advocates, 20% are other related advocates, such as sexual assault, housing. We have 16% are mental health care providers, therapists, counselors, and then 14% who identify as a survivor of domestic and or sexual violence. So thank you so much for participating in that. That will help our panelists just have a deeper understanding of who's listening. So I'm going to stop sharing those results. So thank you for participating in that poll. And now it's officially time to introduce today's panelists. So as you can see, we have 5 experienced panelists who will be sharing their expertise with us today. Just as an FYI, Dr. Sheila Sweeney will be hopping on around 1:30, leaving at 2, but she'll do her introduction at that time. So we will kind of skip over her before we start the next questions, just so you're aware we're not missing her. All right, so we'll go ahead and start with Meg.
Hello. So you might be able to tell by the length of my introduction here that I have in a previous life worked as a content writer and an editor, so I'm a little wordy, but my current profession is as a mental health therapist and a yoga teacher. My most recent role has been working as a multi-systemic therapist. And what I do in that role is working with families and children to evaluate family systems, community systems, school systems, really drawing on the strengths of those systems to help the entire ecology around the youth heal. And in that work, I have definitely done a lot of work around trauma recovery and trauma-informed care, both with the youth and with their caregivers. And yeah, I also teach yoga, and I'm currently in the process of becoming more trauma-informed in the ways in which I teach my yoga classes. Thanks for having me, Brenny.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you for being here. So we'll go ahead and move on to Dorothy.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Chella. I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor here in Minnesota. I'm also a board-approved supervisor. I currently work full-time at Face-to-Face Health and Counseling, which is a nonprofit organization that focuses on working with youth and young adults. So there I work with ages 11 to 24 with a kind of vast amount of issues, from like anxiety, depression, definitely trauma-related things such as sexual assault, neglect, abuse. Even I've had a few clients lose homes in fires, and so different types of trauma like that in their lives. And then I also work part-time at a private practice called Cedar Valley Center for Child and Family Therapy in Eagan. I'm there on Fridays, and I primarily work with ages 13 and older with a lot of the same issues, And both of the locations, the majority of my clients are primarily Black, Indigenous people of color. So yeah, that is my intro.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. All right, so we'll move on to Pathul.
I think you might be muted, Bethul.
Oh, and I had a great spiel. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Pathul LaFleur. I'm the Executive Director of Oasis of Love Crisis Intervention. I am also a victim survivor and thriver. I work with men, women, and children impacted by domestic violence, sexual assault, and some trafficking. I have been a transplant in the state of Minnesota for now 17 years. And getting into this work, I've been in this work on this side of things for the last 4 years. But being on this side of work, it always humbles me, and it helps me to remind myself to help people to keep their dignity, to know that they're not alone, and to help them to thrive past their trauma. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here, Pathul. We will advance on to Rochelle.
Hi guys, my name is Rachel, and I'm a legal advocate with Domestic Abuse Project here in Minneapolis. I've been there since last August, so relatively new compared to all of you guys. But I do extensive safety planning. I work on flea plans. I do help people getting orders for protection and assisting in court when COVID isn't happening in Hennepin County. But primarily, I'm working with survivors of DV. Domestic Abuse Project as a whole offers therapy for people who have used abusive behaviors, survivors, as well as child witnesses, and we offer advocacy and case management. So that's just a little bit about what I do. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you, Rachel. My apologies for. Thank you for introducing yourself. And this is lovely Sheila. She will introduce herself further. I won't speak for her, but you can kind of skim through her bio a little bit. Just like the other panelists, she's wonderful, has a lot to contribute, so I'm excited to have her join in about 20 minutes. All right, so we will officially dive into some more specific questions about healing and trauma-informed care now that we know a little bit more about our panelists. And our first question is, what does trauma-informed advocacy or care mean to you? And a secondary question follow-up to that could be, what does that look like in practice? So anyone, if they feel ready, they can go ahead and unmute themselves and kick us off.
Sure. So first, I want our audience to first know what the definition of trauma actually is. It's hard to be able to deal with something, to work through it, if we don't know how to define it. And trauma, by definition, is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, emotional shock following a stressful event or a physical injury, which may be associated with physical shock and sometimes leads to long-term neuroses. It can come from a physical injury. It can happen from something that isn't physical. It can happen from something we witnessed. But what does trauma-informed advocacy or care look like? To me, it means assessing people, evaluating those clients that come into our office or people that you meet or work with. that you recognize that there are signs and symptoms of something more deeply rooted, and it causes our behaviors, actions, emotions, and the things that we do produce or not produce. It causes us to do things differently that may seem normal to a person experiencing trauma, but not necessarily the onlooker. So trauma-informed advocacy and care looks differently as it is applied to every person that comes into our office. The work is the same, but the application is different. You may have a child that has witnessed abuse, and so you're going to treat them differently, of course, with information, education, and with evaluating how they operate. What I would do with a child is going to be a lot differently with what I would do with an adult female or an adult male. And so we work through a lot of different curriculum. We work through one-on-one individual counseling. We work through group sessions, because a lot of times people don't want to feel that they are the only person experiencing any form of trauma, that they're not alone. And so it is very hand-holding as well as very empowering to help our clients heal from trauma, period. What does that practice look like? I think I just shared it. It looks differently as it's applied to individuals, men, women, and children. But the outcome and the goal is always the same. It's resiliency and recovery. It's healing, self-preservation, and the ability to strengthen family, individual, community.
Thank you. If anyone else wants to add on to that or present new ideas or anything that came to their mind when they read this question.
I'd just like to echo what Pathul said about strengthening all of the systems. As I mentioned in my introduction, I've done a lot of work recently in systems-based interventions, and I do agree that to achieve healing or resiliency or strengthening of the individual, what I've seen really help with that is also strengthening those systems around them and really working with that survivor to identify, which of these systems can we call in to be of help to you in your healing journey? Which of these are going to be able to support you the best? Which ones do you not want involved? And that's, for me, that's a very big part of the trauma-informed care as well, is always giving my clients the choice. Because I may have some clinical idea of a system that I think would be really great to involve, but if I go over my clients' heads and involve that system without their consent, they don't want that system involved, or a person, that in and of itself can be re-traumatizing. It can cause them to feel like they don't have control over a situation. And that's the opposite, really, of trauma-informed care to me. So again, just really echoing involving those systems as we're also healing the individual. That's been a really big part of the work that I've done.
Meg, would you mind giving a few examples of what you mean by systems?
Absolutely, yeah. So in my work, specifically what I have done, my identified clients are adolescents aged 12 to 17. But the unique thing about my program is I work with the caregivers of those youth. So I don't work directly with the youth themselves unless they choose to become involved. But when we talk about systems around that youth, we could be talking about the family system itself, which is very close to the youth. Those caregivers can have a really positive impact on how their child is developing and growing as an individual. Other systems might be the peer group that the youth associates with, the school system, so the staff that they interact with on a daily basis. We do have youth who are referred to us through, the juvenile justice system and through children's mental health case management. So those would also be other systems, more formal support systems. And you see to widely varying degrees how much the caregivers and the youth wish to engage with those different systems. So it's really finding a balance that the family is comfortable with. But that systems approach, it doesn't only apply to youth, it can also apply to adults, right? Like, so what are the systems that surround your adult clients? Their friends, co-workers, things like that. So it's really, the way I think of it is, who is surrounding this person or this family, and who can be the best support for them in their healing.
Thank you for expanding on your answer. Would anyone else like to add anything to this question?
I can. One thing I would add that is really important that I think to the work that I do is normalizing. I think that a lot of people, especially when they talk about trauma, whether it's violent trauma or anything that they've kind of gone through that has shook up their system or really affected them in any way, it's really normalizing the feelings that you have associated with trauma, because there's a vast majority of feelings and thoughts and reactions that people have to traumatic events, and they can look different from person to person, even people in the same family. So really normalizing their feelings. And then the second really important part is really validating their feelings, validating their experiences, validating what they're saying happened to them as true. Because I think a lot of what I see a lot of youth doing and clients doing is kind of reality testing, where they're like, well, is this okay that this happened? And then is this okay that this happened? Should this have happened? And kind of really processing for them, like, it wasn't okay that the person treated you like that you were this was said to you. Because I think that when you're in any type of traumatic event or traumatic kind of relationship, it shifts your balance, and it kind of can shift what you defined as your line, as a boundary, what you define as your normal, and kind of helping them reassess the things that are their boundaries and are what is normal to them, and then really validating that what happened to them was real and it wasn't okay.
Thank you. And just to clarify, when you're talking about normalizing, it sounds like you're talking about normalizing the response to something that is outside of the realm of normal and trying to reconstruct what does normal mean, but not normalizing the traumatic experience, but more so the reaction. Is that what you were getting at, or?
Yeah, normalizing the traumatic experiences, or normalizing, especially when I think of domestic violence or survivors, a lot of people talk about, like, I still in love with this person, I still have feelings, I still care, and really normalizing that of course you do. Just because this event happened doesn't mean that your feelings turn off like a light switch, that you can have that kind of control on and off. And so I think a lot of normalizing caring for that person, and then normalizing having mixed feelings about leaving or staying or whatever the decision is, and kind of normalizing the process of healing, that it is going to look, a lot of people I think healing is a linear line, you just have to take this step to this step to this step, and then it's kind of a roller coaster. There's going to be ups and downs throughout the process, and that is a normal part of it.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, if everyone feels good about this question, we'll move on to the second one. All right, so the next question is, can someone heal from trauma that they won't identify as trauma? So you can let me know if you need more context for this question. So I'll just provide a little bit of, many people in a survivor's life could identify their experience, that person's experience, as trauma or abuse. However, some people who are experiencing that might be reluctant to name their experience as wrong or as trauma, or label it as abusive. So what can advocates and providers and other concerned people do in this person's life to support them? Just to kind of bolster that question, if that isn't enough. But opening the floor to anyone who kind of wants to speak on this question.
Sure, great. So this is Katul. As a victim survivor, this is a really good question. The first answer is yes. However, one has to recognize that there is a problem, or at least be brought to the realization that there is a challenge that can be sorted out and worked through. As a victim, before I got to my survivorship and thrivership, as a victim, I never wanted to acknowledge or recognize that I was an abuse victim. I knew that the way in which the dynamics of my household worked were not normal. But I did not realize, nor did I take the inventory to say, I am an abuse victim. I need help. The two didn't go together. I needed help to get away was one thing, and being an abuse victim didn't correlate with that. It just wasn't a part of it. And so as long as I did not acknowledge that I was in abuse or in a traumatic situation, I could not get away from it. So I wasn't able to heal that way. It was after I was able to walk away and openly express that I needed help and that I was not strong enough to do it myself, was I able to take inventory that I was in a traumatic situation, that my children were exposed to trauma, and I had to then be healthy enough mentally, physically, and emotionally to want to heal. So yes, it can happen. Yes, healing can happen even when we don't identify it as trauma, but that healing comes with help. I do not believe that this is a walk alone process, nor can it happen on your own. And I often share that with our clients, participants, or those feeling they need some coaching, is that you don't have to do it alone. And when we go in it with the premise that I'm in this alone, I don't know where to start, I don't know how to begin, then we find ourselves mentally self-talking ourselves out of healing. But if we allow for someone to stand with us and help us, then absolutely 100% healing can take place. Because as that help comes, we then begin to identify, acknowledge, or recognize that there is a problem. I may not have the tools or all of the abilities to get myself out, but with help, I can heal. Yes.
Thank you for sharing your experience and your perspective on that, Bethul. Does anyone else want to add to this question?
Yeah, I agree completely with Bethul. I think that the thing about trauma is we talk about it widely in like mental health, and there's this general understanding of it among people working in that field. I think trauma is a very loaded word for a lot of people, and a word that a lot of people don't want to relate to and don't feel like they can. And I don't think that it's necessary or important for us to convince people that that's something that aligns with them. And I think that if people don't kind of connect with that term, if they don't feel like they've been traumatized, then kind of putting down these lines and saying that there's required elements for healing runs the risk of people feeling like they're excluded or like their experience doesn't count because they just couldn't connect with those feelings. So I think, like Dorothy was saying earlier, healing isn't linear. Healing looks different for different people. I think to some extent, it does require acknowledging that maybe you've been wronged in some way, that what happened to you was not your fault. But I don't think that that requires people naming that they've been traumatized. I think that it's okay if a client comes to you and they're sharing their experience to validate that, like, wow, that sounds like it could have been a traumatizing experience. And I think a lot of people appreciate that, especially if their experience has been minimized, or, you know, they've been gaslighted a lot. But I also think if someone says, you know, that doesn't really sit with me, then that's totally okay too. And however, you know, they want to work through it and heal, it's just kind of our job to validate that and say, you know, you've had this experience and you're a survivor, and we're still here to support you. So
Thank you, Rachel. Any final thoughts about this question before we move on?
I want to add one thing. So others may not be able to convey with themselves that they've experienced trauma, and this is why it's really important to define a thing. Because if you sit with someone and you inform them or educate them, it gives them a better idea of what trauma actually is or looks like. And then you can go through a slew of check boxes. That's why I say you evaluate, you assess, and you allow people to see with information and education. So you may not feel that this has been a traumatic experience. However, if you look at the definition, if you look at some key things, maybe this is what it is. And that's when that education information begins to help someone, one, identify or acknowledge something has happened. Now, what do I do about it? So I always go back to defining and sharing information.
Thank you. Meg, did you want to add something quick to this?
Yeah, I just wanted to add the thought that for me, the process in working with survivors, whether or not they identify as such, or whether or not they identify their experiences as traumatic, for me as a mental health provider, it's really important to keep my own feelings about it in check, and really be able to acknowledge as I'm working with these individuals that, again, my idea of what's going on, like others have said, may not land with them. It may not sound right, feel right. They may not think that's what happened. And it's a process for me as a provider as well to just say, I'm going to be with them where they are in this moment. And if they don't reach this point that I'm hoping that they can see when they're with me, kind of like Pathul said, like education, just get them closer to that, get them closer to understanding that experience, give them the information that's going to be helpful, whether they come to that realization with you or without you. The ultimate goal is their healing. So if you're helping them progress toward that, in my opinion, that is a success, even if they don't name it out loud with you in the time that they work with you.
Thank you, Meg. And I see that Dr. Sheila Sweeney has joined us. So I'm going to go ahead and allow Dr. Sheila Sweeney to introduce herself.
Okay. I am Sheila Sweeney, and I am pleased to be here. And I run a private practice in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I work with many people in the community around healing experiences and turning trauma into healing language, and turning, the notion that one becomes their trauma, helping people to dispel that and know that healing is possible. So that's all I'll say is I do community work. I love to educate folks on mental health and psychotherapy, and just help people get to where they're going.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. We'll go ahead and advance to the next question. And Sheila, if you have something to say right away, you can go ahead and start us off if you'd like. But the question is, how can you truly center a survivor in their healing process and journey? How do you balance promoting survivor agency and providing professional guidance?
Well, I'll jump in at the top one just to kind of jump in here. How can you truly center a survivor in their healing process and journey? I've learned to partner with the survivor. and help them to know that their story, whatever their story is valid, and that it's their experience, and that it's their story. So I encourage them to share that story with me, and also to share that story out loud so that they hear their own story, maybe sometimes for the first time, or the way that they have put it together. And so through that, centering them is really just to get it outside of them. And maybe they won't call it trauma, or they won't call it something bad at first, because some people don't really understand that some things that have happened to them are bad, or it's seen as an adversity or things like that. And so centering them is to really help them tell their truth, their story, and let it be an ongoing process, because that truth or that story may not come out all at once. So that's where I typically will start with someone and helping them to do that, and then continue to allow that story to unfold, and then jump in where I can to help them name it, frame it, or whatever is needed. But I partner with them in their care, because they're the experts at who they are. And then we go from there in partnership. So centering, I think, is really people really understanding what needs to come out. Like, what is it? Even if they're not calling it trauma or healing. Some people don't think healing is possible. They've told me that in the last few months.
Thank you, Sheila, for sharing that. Does anyone else share their thoughts about this question that has come up for them?
Yeah, I'll share. I think this comes up a lot when we do safety planning appointments. You know, we always say it's our job to present people with options, and it's not our job to tell them what the best ones are. We meet people at their hardest times, and we have to hold that, like, for some people, this might be the first big step that they've taken for themselves. And part of the healing process is allowing them to, like, have that meaningful experience and validating that they're the only ones that know what the best next step is. So I think when it comes to safety planning, when it comes to advocacy, the way you have to look at it is it's our job to provide options and to say, this is what's out there. And then to make sure that they know that they're the ones that know what the right move forward is. And to make sure not to take away the space of them navigating that by themselves, because that's part of the healing process. And sometimes people show up and they want some more guidance, you know, because it's a hard time. But the reality of the situation is advocates can't possibly know what the best move is. And it's important to, like, validate that and empower them to make the right decision on their own.
That's good, Rachel. I would also like to add to that, that in truly centering a survivor in their healing process, and I don't know if it's truly centering, but allowing people to be who they are, the way that they are, how they come in, not trying to shift or change them in those moments. I think that allowing people to have their emotions, to have their cry out, they're getting it out, as Dr. Sweeney mentioned, is very important, and it is very healthy. Because again, we do want them to get it out, but we also don't want them to lose dignity in the process. And so a big piece for Oasis of Love is always making sure that our clients, whether it's a male, a female, or a child, that they don't lose their dignity in the process. We help them through. I always say we coach. I don't tell them what to do. We give them options. We give them resources. We give them tools. We ask if they need a little more support in getting to that next step. But we always start with, this journey is from crisis to success. I don't say that to the client, but my focus is from crisis to success. How do we get you out of the acute situation, leave you with your dignity, still help you to be as healthy as you possibly can be, express yourself, be able to articulate what it is that you feel, what it is you believe you need, or what you think you need, and allowing them space to say they don't know what they don't know, and giving them a level of comfort, cultural comfort, as well as emotional comfort, that they are not alone. And in doing this work, being a victim, survivor, thriver also helps with allowing them to process and get it out, because we can share different stories, not necessarily how I would do it or what I would do, but just saying you're not alone in this. So it does help.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bethel. Any additional thoughts on this question? All right, I think we're ready to move on then. All right, so the next question is, many survivors struggle with self-forgiveness. How can advocates and providers support survivors through this process being self-forgiveness? And then a follow-up question is, how do you help a survivor hold two seemingly opposing truths? So something that was mentioned earlier as the two truths existing as, you know, still loving someone who has also hurt you, as being an example of that.
I'm going to answer that. Oh, sorry. Did you want to go ahead?
You can go.
Okay. I was just going to say that the second half of that question brought up a light bulb for me. I did research with young adult African-American mothers on reflective functioning to see if they were able to see whatever has happened to them in their life story, if they could do something about it or understand what happened, would they change the pattern that they can then give to their own children? And so when I say that, they had to hold two opposing truths. One, yes, I had bad stuff happen to me during my own childhood, and I don't want this to happen to my child. So in order for them to hold those truths and then attend to the child without being triggered themselves, is they kind of had to compartmentalize for a little bit their own stuff. So they had to put that kind of on the shelf. I mean, not really that we could or should be doing that, but in this case, it was the best case scenario, because they wanted to prevent passing along any bad things or abuse or patterns that they didn't want to show up in their own children. So they put that away, and then they attended to their child's needs so that they can show their children that there's a better way, a different way, and then saying, okay, now I'm going to come back and deal with my own stuff. And now how can we, bring it back together to deal with this together? And so sometimes we have to put things in different places before we can bring them all back together and synthesize and integrate them so that they work in harmony. But you just help people however it works to symbolize some of those things and help them just to categorize whatever makes sense for them, however they've been doing it, so that they can do that, and see that that's possible. It doesn't mean that just because one doesn't work, the other can't. And I think we just have to sometimes show people how to hold those truths, because I think we're used to juggling multiple truths. We just don't really realize it always.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Sheila. And Dorothy, did you want to add something?
To the first part, I think the way that advocates and providers can help support survivors through the process is really just sitting with them to process how this started. Because I think people can forget in the beginning of why they fell in like or love or whatever it is. I like to use humor as part of my therapy. And so it's kind of like, what I work with clients to say is like, you would not have fallen in love with someone who was an asshole 24/7. No one is mean or all of something all the time. And so how do you go back to remembering the things, the reasons you fell in love, like the reasons that you continued to stay, the reasons that you continue to engage in things? Because I think at the end and in the beginning of the healing process, there's so much of shame and shock and different things that can come up. And I think it's really important to kind of remember, like, you fell in love with this person for a reason. And people do hide different parts of themselves. And so when you got to see different parts, it's not like your mind was like, okay, now this person is entirely this part now, And so it definitely takes time to come to a realization to leave. It takes time to get that power to leave. It takes time to process what's happening to you. And so it's kind of like, how do you go back and remember all of those things? Because I think by the time that you're at the end and you feel all this shame, it's hard to forgive yourself, because it's like, I never thought I would be this person. I never thought I'd be in this kind of relationship. I always said that I wouldn't. And I also kind of add for people, especially people, children who have witnessed domestic violence, or people who even say things like, I would never end up like this, just really remembering that cycles are cycles for a reason. And that it's really hard to break out of cycles, because a lot of the times when what you're asking yourself is to do something different that your mind and body is probably asking you to do, because it's so used to that cycle. And so it takes a lot of time to get to the point where you can be ready to be done or move on or move forward. And so how do you acknowledge that you're human, and that that's part of what happened during all of this time? You're a human being who was in love or in like, or you cared about this person. And so you prioritize them. You prioritize them over yourself. And so it's kind of like, how do you slowly do the work with a survivor to really get to the root of a lot of those things, so that self-forgiveness can be accessed?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dorothy. Bethul, did you want to add something?
I would agree with both Dorothy and Dr. Sheila. Yeah, most definitely.
Great. Any final thoughts about anything on this slide?
Can I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
It's just bringing up something that I learned when I was in undergrad, and I took a violence class and learned about the violence wheel for the first time. And I remember the professor telling me that, there was something about survivors leaving and staying when it came to domestic violence. And we talked a lot about the word hope. And that had opened my eyes and ears to so much more in thinking about the underlying meaning for that person of hope. What are they hoping will get better? Like that they might hope, because again, we look at patterns of what were they receiving in their care receiving experience or growing up, and what patterns did they get used to. And maybe there's always been this hope that things will get better, a hope that this person will do something different, a fantasy, right? And so sometimes that truth is holding on to, that fantasy, even though it may or may not be a reality for that person, but also understanding and asking the questions of what are you hoping that would happen, in this, and not wanting to accept the maladaptive treatment, but what are you hoping that would get better, and helping those truths to really align with where they're at and what they're experiencing, and what have they experienced in the past that might be a pattern from their childhood adversities. So I just wanted to mention that as well, because that was a real eye-opener for me and helped me understand on a much, much deeper level.
Thank you. All right. The next question is, what about, and this has been mentioned earlier, so it's a great segue, what about the healing journey gets lost when the focus is consumed with convincing the victim survivor to leave an abusive relationship and or household?
I think I might be able to speak to that just briefly. When you're consumed with trying to convince this person to leave, what may end up happening is you overlook elements of safety that need to be put into place before that can safely occur, which can end up further traumatizing this individual, putting them in harm's way unnecessarily. But in another way, it can remove a sense of autonomy from that individual, from their own healing journey. It can cause this individual to feel like they are not in control of the direction of their life. If somebody is pushing them to leave before they are ready, before they feel safe to do so, before they've reached that stage where they say, I'm ready to make this change. I know something is wrong. I'm ready to do it. If they are vulnerable in any way or really feeling pushed to leave, it can just, that in and of itself can be re-traumatizing, because you're taking away independence and autonomy over their personal journey. That's been a big thing that I've learned in my experiences working with survivors.
Thank you, Meg.
I think the first thing that comes up for me when I see this question is convincing is not something that I feel like is our role. I can give you education, I can give you resources, but I'm not going to be the one that decides for you whether you leave or not. And I'm not trying to convince you to make a decision that you're not ready for or not. So I think some of it is really getting to a place of like, if you're trying to convince the person, my assumption would be that it's because of safety and fear and different things. And so it's like, how do you, as the support person or the therapist or whoever, kind of take care of yourself, because it is not your decision. And I think one thing that gets lost is that if you do continuously try to convince someone of something, you're also pitting them against somebody that they care about. And so you don't ever want to be in that position, which is why, it's things that I like to say to clients is like, I'm not the one that gets to decide this for you either way. I'm going to support you either way. I just want to continue to guide you through the process and support you through the process and give you all the resources that you need. But I'm not going to be upset or disappointed in you or any of these things that could potentially get them not to come back because you think that I think you should do this, because my opinion in this really doesn't matter. It's yours. It's your choice. And I can only give you all of the resources to make that choice. So I think something that has come up for me too when I have clients that are definitely in abusive relationships and I'm definitely fearful for them. A lot of that is like, how do I take care of myself? Because I know that I have done everything that I can do, and I'm only human, as that they are only human. And while I want the best for them, I'm not the one that gets to decide that. And really, really making sure that you're not pushing to a point where you pit yourself against the person that they care about, because then they're not going to come to you for support, and they need that support if they've talked to you about it or if they've reached out to you about it. And really remembering that you're centering the survivor, and as much as you want safety to kind of be the center of things, it's their choice at the end of the day.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. Yeah, I know even from doing trainings with landlords, a common frustration that we hear is, I trespass this person who's abusive, and then I see them inviting them back into the household, and I don't know how to help this person anymore because I've done what I could. And kind of talking about the cycle that you mentioned earlier. So I really like what you said about being able to take care of yourself and grounding yourself in what is the survivor's definition of success and where are they at this moment, and how can I support them in that and be okay with that and be okay with the decisions that they make and truly be able to support them no matter what. So thank you so much for that. Dorothy. Additionally, there's just a comment from an attendee saying, I think Patricia, I agree. She says, I tell people all the time that no matter what you say, in most cases, until the victim is ready to leave, they will not. So that's just a contribution from some of the attendees as well.
I would also just like to highlight and reiterate, because I know it was mentioned briefly, but when a survivor decides to leave, that's the most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship. So, beyond violating their autonomy and pushing all these things that are very important to the healing process, there is a huge risk in someone deciding to leave. And they have very good reasons for being concerned about taking that step. And we don't want to overlook that either. So there are significant safety concerns that come into play at that moment that need to be addressed as well.
And I would just say that I would like to agree with each of you that have spoken, especially about the convincing the victim survivor to leave. We have to be very careful that we don't want to re-victimize someone that is coming to sit in front of us, as well as remove them from their comfort. And I put air quotes around comfort because it's already an uncomfortable situation but they're more comfortable being in that situation versus being away from it because they don't know what the unknown brings. Safety is always a big issue. Lethality is a big issue, and so we always want to make sure that we remain neutral as we are supporting our clients. I think about how holistic our approach is with our organization, that we support men, women, and children. So it's not one focus on one versus the other. And one of our goals at Oasis of Love, and we are a faith-based organization, is where possible, we want to restore families, because that is very important, especially in the heart of where we work in our culturally specific families that we support. Where it is possible, again, I repeat that, where it is possible, we would like to see families restored. And so we're not usually pressing anyone to leave unless it really needs to be the focus that you leave, because it just won't work. But we want to make sure that we keep families in mind. We want to keep families in mind a lot of times, but I 100% agree with Dorothy. We're not convincing victims to leave. We want them to make decisions on their own based on the education, information, and their comfort level.
Absolutely, thank you. Any final thoughts before we move on to the next question? Great. All right. So this next question is, how can healing contribute to breaking the cycle of violence, whether that cycle is within a relationship or across generations? Secondary question is, how can you incorporate family systems into this process?
So again, from experience, I am the product of a mother being in an abusive situation. I didn't witness it, I was too young, but I know the effects of it because I've grown up with that. I've seen how my sister and my siblings react or respond to my mother, and then the way that I do, because I didn't witness the way that they did. But I also know that through this, and it's something that I've done with my children, my mother was very instrumental in breaking the cycle because her mother experienced it as well. And what she began to do is, as she healed, and I witnessed that process, as she healed, she began to teach us how to care for ourselves, how to be strong, how to be independent. And while I was all those things, I was a college graduate, I had my own, a lot of things still come to play. But when you then have already had knowledge of what abuse looks like, what it is, and who you are, it's easier to come out of it. And then you're able to, for yourself, identify trouble signs. You're able to identify what's right, what's wrong, what's healthy, what's not. And then you share that with your children so that they do not go into the same cycles of violence and abuse that you witness, because the witnesses are going to be, if it's not taken care of or acknowledged, the witnesses become either very aggressive or very passive. And that is how they begin to operate in their relationships, whether it's friendships, intimate partner relationships, work-related relationships. They then don't know how to have healthy relationships with anyone. And so what has been my ideal and my continued feat with my family is that they recognize that they acknowledge and that they are able to move on, that we don't have to be stuck anywhere, not on a job, not in a friendship, not in a relationship, not with a vehicle. If you don't like it, if it doesn't feel good, if it doesn't look good, what are your options to moving on and getting out? That's it.
Thank you. I don't want to single you out, but I know that time is short just for Sheila to get back to her busy day. But I wanted to give you an opportunity if there's anything you wanted to say for this question before we sign off.
I was just going to say, I wholeheartedly agree with what Bethel just said. That is just so, like, just chills went all over my body, because I understand that language more than a little bit. And I love, you know, just having each person kind of tell their story in the family who has witnessed it, who has felt it, who has experienced it. And I always, you know, help my own family, my own self, and people that I work with, you know, kind of tap into our own abilities to stop the cycle, and then to teach generations who come after us, you know, that it's okay and what to look for. So everything, I would just say yes, put a big stamp of yes on that. I agree with that. And just helping people to talk about those cycles and those generations, even for folks who aren't ready to talk about it yet, or who did see that there was something okay about that, but just seeing where, you know, where can we help families to talk about this and be more open, so that it doesn't become the thing that doesn't get talked about in our family. So we have to break cycles that way. I'll leave with my favorite quote in the whole wide world is, when one comes in for healing, we help those who came before us, and we help heal those generations who come after us. So we who step up to the plate of healing, we have a great job to do, but we also have to model vulnerability and healing ourselves, so that other people can know that it's possible, even for families who have had generations and generations and generations of saying that this has been okay. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Sheila.
Bye-bye.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you too.
Any other additional thoughts about this question? All right, we have about 2 more, so I think we have time to kind of dig into those before we move on to the applied section, and then questions from the attendees. So the next question here is, how can we support survivors in learning how to trust themselves and others after experiencing domestic and/or sexual violence? And how do we, as advocates, therapists, social service providers, how do we build rapport and discuss boundaries with them as well?
I've found that a way for me to build rapport and establish boundaries with my clients is to be incredibly forthcoming and transparent about my process. I don't want my clients to ever feel like I am doing things behind the scenes that they don't know about, that they're not aware of. I just like to be very upfront about what the process is going to look like. If I don't know an answer, I make sure that my clients know that, and I try to do what I can to get them the answer if possible, or direct them to somebody who can give them an answer that they're looking for. But for me, really just being very transparent and open about, what to expect as a client of mine, what to expect from me, kind of what the process generally looks like for clients in therapy. That tends to put most of my clients at ease. And it's something that I don't just say at the beginning and then just trust that they're going to trust that. It's also something that I have to demonstrate throughout my relationship with the survivor. I have to be able to show through my actions in session and outside of session that, I keep to my word and I keep to transparency. And same thing with boundaries. I find that with a lot of the folks that I work with, modeling those types of things can be really helpful, because when you have been in a situation of abuse, either growing up or in a relationship, your view on boundaries may become distorted to some degree. And it may be difficult to understand what's a porous boundary, what's a really rigid boundary, how does that look in practice? So what I try to do when I'm working with clients is demonstrate to them, this is a healthy professional boundary. Here's what I can do. Here's what I cannot do. Let me be really open and honest about that. And just try to make them part of that process and help them be fully aware of, like, this is how it works working with me. It may look different with other providers, but this is what you can expect from me. And, I'm going to follow through on that in my actions and words.
Absolutely. Thank you, Meg.
That's good. How can we support survivors in learning how to trust themselves and others after a traumatic experience such as domestic violence or sexual assault? In working with our families, I teach them how to trust through my action. I let them know that, healing doesn't take place overnight, and we have trauma triggers that it is going to be difficult to trust. We want to coach, again, our families, how not to just jump in, eyes wide shut. We try to teach, educate, inform, and give resources and tools on how to rebuild for healthy relationships and behaviors. We share with them the power and control wheel. We share with them information that educates them and rebuilds, one, their sense of self-confidence and self-worth, as well as identifying early signs of mistreatment in any type of relationship. So when we have clients that come in, I don't only speak about relationships that are intimate partner. I speak about all relationships, because if we have had any sort of trauma, whether it stemmed from childhood to adulthood, we have to recognize that we don't always treat people fairly as well, because we have some things that are taking place on the inside of us that have our triggers up, our alarms up. And so we have to, as we are working through the healing process, we have to kind of dismantle and dispel all those old behaviors of what relationships are and have been, because we want them to see things as a go forward, that from this day forward, I'm doing things differently. And so we have to coach that. We have to handhold with that, and then we have to provide tools and resources for them to build up their ability and their capabilities to trust themselves, as well as learn how to trust others. And discussing boundaries is a big thing for me. I teach my children about boundaries, but how do we build rapport and discuss boundaries? So as Meg has mentioned, as Sheila has mentioned, as Dorothy has mentioned, and Rachel, we build rapport with our clients, right? So we have to treat everyone the same but different. I'm going to treat every client that comes in as a new client, period. I've just met you. This is the beginning of my day. I'm going to treat you with respect, and I'm going to treat you with attention. And so through that, you build rapport. You get to know people. You don't just look at forms and check everyone off the list. They're not just a number. They're not just another client. They are a person with real feelings, with real emotions, with fears, with all these things that are going on that has made them who they are through their experiences. And then we have to acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge that they've had experiences that have brought them to the place that they are. And in acknowledging that, we also have to make sure that we give them boundaries with us, and they give us boundaries with them, that we tell them or give them the ability to say, I don't like the way that feels in this conversation. I never want anyone to sit across from me and become re-victimized, or they're losing their dignity because of something I may have said or didn't say. And so I always make sure with our clients that I build boundaries with them as well as tell them to set boundaries with me.
Thank you.
One thing that I would add with boundaries is that first thing I would do with clients is making sure they know what they are, really defining it and going through it. And then I think it's really easy to kind of talk to people about boundaries. But what I like to do, especially with like young people, is just being like, let's talk about what gets in the way of boundaries. If you're going to set a boundary with this person, what do you think is going to happen? And then how can we work to combat whatever they might say in the back and forth, or how they might feel? And like, when do you disengage or walk away and just set the boundary really firmly? Because I think it's hard in practice. I mean, it's easy kind of in a way to do it one-on-one when you're talking to someone who's empowering you and doing these things. But I think we really have to walk through what is hard about setting a boundary with your partner or your family member or at work or whatever. And what do you think is usually the responses, what makes it hard, so that we can really truly practice so that they feel really confident. Because one thing that I like to tell clients is that when we practice something, it makes it harder to be caught off guard in the moment. But I think it's really easy to be caught off guard in moments when someone says something shocking or says something that you're not expecting, or you're like, I just don't know how to respond. But if we've practiced it, then you're not in the moment having to create no information. It's like, I did this with Dorothy. This is what I have to do. And I've even gotten feedback that that's helpful, because at least they're like, I know what to say, and I'm not just creating the words in the moment of anxiety or stress or conflict, where I kind of can freeze or my mind will go blank. And so I think a lot of it is like, how do you really practice boundaries when you're with the person that you're working with, survivor, to really get them to have confidence in doing it, and then feel prepared for when boundaries are crossed. Because I think it's really important too to talk about boundaries are going to get crossed, and it's normal, it sucks, but it happens because people are trying to get a need met. Or they feel like, oh, you've never done this before, and so if I keep going, then I will get what I want out of this. And so it's really empowering them and giving them a lot of information that people are going to break it, and you're going to just keep doing it and doing it until that person is probably able to see over time, like, oh, they're serious about this. This is really something that they're talking about and that I shouldn't keep doing.
I'd like to just say, agree with that 100%. Absolutely.
And she said the magic word, it's empowering the client.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding that. Boundaries can be really scary for people who have either tried to implement them and have been harmed as a result of that, or feel like it takes away from the relationship or the connection to that person if they do establish a boundary, or it might feel foreign to them, it might feel different. So I really like what Dorothy said about being able to experience it. Like, what would it feel like to tell someone this is what's okay, this is what's not okay, and for them to respect that, which I definitely agree can be absolutely empowering. So thank you for all of your wonderful responses to that. We're gonna get to the applied section quick, so we'll have ample time for questions from the attendees. So this is just a section. I just threw in some things, to be honest, so we can, if you think of a specific tools, specific wording, specific things that you think advocates and social service providers and mental health providers would benefit from, feel free to jump in and add to anything. And we touched on this earlier, but just a little more formal representation of what trauma-informed care, advocacy, what the principles of that are, and it's been often conceptualized with these 5 different factors. And I kind of wanted to format it this way, with safety being at the top, at the pinnacle of all these different principles. The physical and emotional safety transcends kind of all those other levels too, if that's the main priority. And then of course, we've talked a lot about empowerment, a lot about choice. earlier as well, of the scope of our practice oftentimes is to be able to present these different options, these different choices, and then also with the next point of collaboration, being able to collaborate with them and making them know that, you know, they're not alone and you have these choices and you can make a decision for this choice today and make a next choice tomorrow, and I'll be there to support you through whatever you decide is best, and you're allowed to change your mind. And then trustworthiness, which we talked a lot about, of building trust with ourselves, building trust with others, and building that rapport with someone who is supporting you as well. So if any of the panelists want to add anything to these principles, you can do so now, but this just might be a helpful visual for our audience.
I would just add that we need to acknowledge that every person that we work with, all individuals want to do well. Everyone that comes through our doors, one of their outcomes is, I want to be good. I want to be able to make it through this. I want to be successful. They may not know what their success looks like, but everyone wants to do well and be better. And so I think some of our focus is really getting them to that outcome of wanting to be well. I don't know how that fits.
What's on your minds? Absolutely. Thank you for contributing that. Great. Okay, so the next little tool, this is just a few trauma treatment approaches. So I don't know if any of the mental health providers want to provide more context for any of these, or propose, you know, other approaches that aren't listed on the screen. And everything is kind of linked to, so when I send out the PowerPoint, you'll be able to click on this and explore what these mean in more depth. But if anyone wants to add on to these approaches as far as kind of treatment is concerned, you can go ahead and add, but if not, that's fine too. We can.
I would just add, it's not exactly like a super formal method of trauma treatment, but there's embodied wellness. So particularly for individuals who have experienced physical or sexual trauma, they can become very disconnected from their physical experience. And so there is some treatment in the world of bringing that individual back into their bodies. There are a lot of different ways of doing that. Yoga and meditation can be one, but there's a lot of benefit in being able to guide clients back into body-focused sensations in a way that is safe, that is at their own pace, and that helps them feel empowered in reclaiming their physical selves.
Thank you, Meg. Any additional comments on kind of treatment approaches? All right. So these next few slides, I'm kind of just going to go through them very quickly because you will all receive a copy of the slides. We've gotten lots of questions about that. You will receive a copy of the PDF, I promise, with all the links. These are just some tools that I've created for women's advocates, including an emotional safety plan with all these different strategies and links to click on, tools for creating a self-care plan. So you'll be able to access all of those, and I'll include the links in the follow-up email as well. So just wanted to show that little visual of some ways to apply a lot of the concepts that we've talked about today. There's Ali from the chat says, polyvagal theory has helped me understand trauma on a deeper level. Absolutely, yeah. I think that's one of the books that I have on this list coming up in a moment here. These are some specific resources for survivors, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but these are just some that I've compiled, and if there's any that anyone wants to add in the chat, I'll be sure to include it in the follow-up email as well. But I found that these have been really helpful for specifically survivors. And then this is a list of resources to continue learning and try out some tools for advocates and providers as well. So a lot of different handbooks, guidebooks, different I try to include different mediums too, so there's a TED Talk in there too. So those are things to continue to explore. And then I also get a lot of questions about book recommendations. So here is a nice long list of some book recommendations to check out that discuss trauma, that discuss healing, that discuss domestic violence specifically. So those are for you to try out and look into if you would like to. And then these are some resources on Women's Advocates website if you want to get connected to other resources, specifically in Minnesota. We do have some national resources as well. So I just wanted to include that too. We get a lot of questions about resources. But now I want to spend the rest of the time answering questions for the panelists from the webinar attendees. So we do have a few, and I see some people are raising their hand. So if you do want to be unmuted, you can send in the chat, unmute me, and I'll unmute you, and you can speak and ask your question. Or you can send it in the Q&A or in the chat as well. And I think what I'm going to do so everyone can see what question we are discussing is kind of edit it and add it into here so everyone can see what we're talking about. Hopefully that will work. So we do have a question in the Q&A that is, oh, sorry, there's some more comments about, Hillary says there are several fields of formal body-based somatic psychotherapies practiced by master level therapists, such as somatic awareness and dance/movement therapy. If you're looking for resources for clients, go to adta.org. And then Hillary also says, thank you so much, panelists. I have to leave early for a session. And then, yeah, narrative exposure therapy is another approach as well. There's a specific question in the Q&A for Dorothy. It won't let me paste it. Here, maybe I can move it. Move it here. Maybe you can see it. So it says, for Dorothy, how do you practice setting boundaries with your clients? The role playing, what tools do you use? So maybe expanding a little more on that practice, what that practice looks like of setting boundaries.
Yep. So role playing is a big one of just like, okay, tell me exactly what your sister would say if you tried to set this boundary, and what would you want to say back, and kind of really breaking it down into what a conversation would look like, because the basis for me for therapy is that the client is the expert in their own life. So they know how people are going to deal with things that they say or probably react to things. So we really just try to go through it. Like I like to do a lot of let's worst case scenario it from This Is Us, of like, what is the worst case scenario that you think would happen during this conversation? And let's process how to prepare for that. Because I think the best thing for boundary setting is preparation, because it's new for a lot of people. And so it's practicing in session and then preparing as much as we can for it. And then I think the beginning though is really helping support them in defining what their boundaries are, because what my boundary is and your boundary is and your sibling's boundary or your partner's boundaries might all look different. And so what are your values and what are your boundaries around different things before you can, and your values around different things before you can set boundaries. So I think it's first being like, what are you okay with and what are you not okay with? What for being treated a certain way. And we can do psychoeducation on healthy relationships and different things to throw that in there so that they have that information. But first I want to start with like, how do you want to be treated in a relationship? How do you want other people in your life to act towards you? And how do we set boundaries around when they cross those things? So that's a lot of kind of the conversations I have.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dorothy. So there's another question from Amanda about what is your approach when a client has untreated alcoholism, addiction, or mental disorders? At what point in this process is it recognized and encouraged to address?
That's a really good question. So part of our policy for clients is we do not service if you are altered. And so we have a practice, and we've had to do this before with some of our clients. If they smell like alcohol, if they smell like marijuana or a street drug, we do acknowledge it. And it is an uncomfortable part of the process, but it all is uncomfortable. And we do it again without them losing their dignity because we have to bring it up. We can't service one part of you if every other part is unhealthy. And so we do bring up the fact that we have staff as well as resources and tools for help. We ask even if there are challenges with alcoholism, with drug abuse, and then we'll tell them why we brought it up. You know, what our concerns are, what we have observed, if there's been some observation of that, if there are children in the home, we address it holistically. Yeah. And I do want to say this to the advocates because it is a very uncomfortable conversation to have with a client that's already in a serious situation. We still want to make sure that we are applying what we know to do as right, that we are applying our role correctly, as well as helping the client holistically become a better person. And some will not accept the help or the support once those things are acknowledged, but others will, and they'll be better for it. So I do want to encourage some of the other advocates to get comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations because they need to be had. And you'll find that it's servicing their need more than it is your discomfort level. So I would acknowledge it, and then make sure that you have structures in place to help them through that.
Thank you for any additional kind of responses to that question about untreated alcoholism, addiction, or mental disorder? Okay.
I saw a question, I think, in the chat about wanting to, like, someone kind of coming for support multiple times, wanting to change and saying that they want to change or get support, but then kind of continuously going back and wanting to support their partner who's unhealthy. So that is something that comes up for me a lot in therapy. And I think one of the things that's been really helpful for me with clients is kind of phrasing, when do you think you started picking that person, your partner, over you? When did you start to prioritize your partner over you? When did you start to choose loving them more than you loved yourself? And that's a way to have them reflect a lot of what has been happening in their relationship and things that have changed. Because nobody starts a relationship necessarily putting somebody first. You're the priority. You're the person that's falling for this person, and you have your own life and different things. And so, but when did it change? When did you start to love this person more? And in what ways do you think you love them more? And really, that's when I feel like I have the opportunity to kind of give examples. Like, so for example, the person's like, oh, the person's suffers from an addiction, their partner, and they want to help them heal from that addiction. I would just say, can you fix someone else's problems for them? Can you do the work for them? Are you working harder than they are working for themselves? Because you're going to fail every time. Every time. Because it's not your thing to heal. And a lot of people love their partners and they love the people in their lives, but I think it's really helping them understand you can only do so much for them. You cannot go to treatment for them. You cannot go to therapy for them. And so I think some of it is also understanding your limitations as a human being. And the more that you have those conversations, I think people come to realizations on their own. I remember the first time I had it, like, you can even have surprising ones. The first time I had it, the person came back like, I was just so pissed all week. Everything they did because it's like, why am I dealing with this? Why do I love them more than I love myself? And it's kind of like, okay, well, let's take a step back and process what happened over the week. Like, what did you see? What did it feel like? Because I'm not necessarily saying like in every single moment you pick them over yourself, but I think it sounds like over this week you've seen a lot of ways that you do that. And maybe you're feeling disappointed in yourself, or maybe you're wondering when that happened. And so let's process that. Let's talk about that. Because that doesn't mean they're ready to leave or they're ready for things to be done, but they're looking at their relationship in a different way than they were before. And that's also something that you want if you really truly want to help and support survivors. If you feel like what they're in is unhealthy or dangerous, they need to come to those things on their own. You can try as much to help them through, and I think there's different questions you can, but really try to help them come to it on their own, because they're not going to come to it because you bring it up every time or because you pressure them or because of all these things. It's going to be a decision they make themselves.
Thank you, Dorothy. There's another question about substance abuse from PJ saying, what if the client flat out denies that there's any substance abuse happening, though all the indicators are present? Do you continue working with them?
So again, we have policies and procedures in place where we actually can ask them to do a UA, especially for two of our programs. We can have the men and the women do urinary analysis because some of them have court orders. Some of them are in the system. Some are probation conditions that have to be met, and so we have the ability to do drops. But if someone denies it, I mean, there are two things. If they deny it, yet you don't see it or you can't witness or observe that they have done it, then you can't prove it. If they deny it and you have observed by smell, experience, witnessing something, then we owe it to them to be honest with them, because a lot of what they've experienced has been a lie. And so one thing that I'm very big on is being very honest, very truthful. And I've come to a place where I am okay having uncomfortable conversations with my clients, but still allowing them to not lose their dignity. So if it is denied, if it is beat down, browbeaten, and I know there is presence of alcohol or altering drug use, then I'll address it. But if they continue to deny it, this, that, or another, that's fine. We just go in at a different way, because as you're going through your healing process, you do have to take evaluation and inventory of yourself about lying, being honest, doing what's best for you. And so it eventually comes out. That's what I'll say. It does eventually come out as you work with your client.
Absolutely. Thank you, Puthul. I do want to acknowledge that it is officially 2:30. We do have some more questions coming in. So if panelists do feel like they have the time and the capacity and are willing to stick around just for a few more minutes to answer some follow-up questions, I encourage you to do that. But for those of you who need to leave us, no worries. When you exit out of the webinar, it will take you to a post-webinar survey. So if you could take a few minutes just filling that out, that would be really helpful for us. And then some more information about certificates of attendance and other links are in the chat too. But I will stick around for a few more minutes or so to kind of answer the remaining questions and everything else. But I just want to thank everyone for attending, for participating, for submitting your questions, for your engagement. It was really wonderful. Thank you. And then we'll kind of resume back to these other questions. But no worries if anyone has to head out. Hopefully I didn't cut anyone off. There's another question And I think this is for Meg. One of the panelists said that they work a lot with systems work and addressing strengths of all systems. I believe there's a panelist that teaches yoga. But I'm wondering if there's a process that is used to brainstorm those individual and system strengths, or a framework that is used.
Yeah, that's a great question. The system that I use is usually it's just a conversation with the client. So part of the process for the particular program that I worked in was to, as part of the evaluation process, really just take some time to sit with the client and say, here's all the systems that are surrounding you and your youth. Let's think about these and really think about what serves you and what doesn't serve you as part of these systems. So, we start first with that individual system, which it is a system. So in this context, focusing on the youth, but for people who work with survivors, you can focus on your identified client, so that survivor, and just say, what is good about this system? What strengths does this individual have? It can be anything, really anything. From skill sets that they possess, resourcefulness, their ability to connect with people, creativity, anything along those lines. And then instead of framing weaknesses as weaknesses, I really try to frame it as areas of growth. So what areas does this particular system have to grow? With the youth that I work with, sometimes it is emotional regulation, right? Like there's still room to grow. For a survivor, it may be boundary setting, right? And it's not a weakness. It's just an area where that person can continue to develop skills. And we just have a conversation about it. I'll write it down. I'll have kind of like a Word document with one side is the strengths and one side is the areas of growth. And we just go piece by piece through the individual system, the family system, the peer system. If the youth is in school, we go through that system, the surrounding community, and then also if they're involved in any formal support systems, so juvenile justice or case management. So what are the strengths and areas of growth for each of those? And that's not just a document that I do at the beginning and set aside. I usually try to draw from that document as much as I can throughout treatment with the families that I work with, and say, if we're coming up against some difficulty in treatment, or, we're just not quite sure where to go, I can refer back to that document and say, well, we talked about the peer group, and your youth has this particular peer that is really helpful. Or maybe this peer over here isn't quite so helpful. So what can we do to kind of increase supervision or make sure that your youth has more access to that helpful youth? And just continuously drawing on what the client has identified as strengths, and just using that throughout the process. And I do see at the bottom, Amanda Cox has asked, I can't help but notice that the spiritual systems aren't being mentioned. For me in my work, the spiritual systems, religious systems are often discussed in those community systems. So are you part of a spiritual or religious community? What strengths does that system have? Do you find a lot of solace in that community? Do you find comfort, or has it not been a supportive system for you? Are there areas of growth in that system? So we do, in a lot of cases, address the spiritual and religious aspects of clients' systems as well. It's just it's folded in more with community.
I speak to the question about the spiritual system. So again, we are a faith-based organization, but we do not impress upon our clients to follow or practice what we follow or practice. But we do have a biblical principle base, the foundation of our work, as well as we allow our clients to practice whatever religious or spiritual system that they feel most comfortable in doing. We allow that. In fact, I have an Eastern Indian male that is a victim survivor, and I have gotten him back into meditation. And so I've meditated with him. He has gone through his way of meditating, and that has helped to center him and help heal with his trauma. Another piece is a lot of our curriculum is biblical based, but we also offer healing techniques through meditation, through effectual tapping techniques. There are many different techniques that we use that do tap into the spiritual system of things, and we acknowledge it, we offer it, and we welcome it. So it does help in the process of healing.
Absolutely, thank you. Thank you so much to Dorothy and Meg for messaging me. You have to go. No worries. Thank you so much for your contributions. They were incredible. I know a lot of people are expressing gratitude for everything that you had to say. So thank you for making time out of your busy schedules and lives to be here. I'll follow up with you via email. And yep, more thank you and everything. But this was wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. We'll kind of address a few more of these questions and then kind of wrap up here. So there is a question from Amanda about how Pathul can be contacted. So you can share that if you would like to, Pathul. And then there's another comment about, I don't know how many people are left on here, but that only 14% reported that they're survivors, and that shocks them. And if we have any thoughts on that. My immediate thoughts were just that most of the advertising for this event were to other advocates and kind of people in the supportive realm. So it does make sense, kind of the distribution of people who identified as advocates and social service providers, just because of who was aware that this webinar was happening. And then sometimes people might not want to identify and report that they're a survivor through a poll as well. So that might be why that percentage is the way it is. But thank you for submitting that question. I think that is all of them. So thank you so much to everyone who submitted questions. If there are any questions that were missed or didn't get addressed, you can feel free to email me or email the panelists. The contact information will be on the slides that I send out in the PDFs. So thank you all so much for being here. Let me know if there's any final thoughts. But
Thank you.
Thank you to Mary Beth for providing additional support for the panel panel attendees. That's appropriate too. Webinar attendees as well. But thank you everyone for joining. We have another webinar next week, so you can sign up and register for that. But you will receive a follow-up email with the PowerPoint slides and the recording and everything in just a few hours once it gets uploaded and everything. So be on the lookout for that email. But thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and officially end the webinar. So
thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, Bernison.
Thank you. Bye, Pathul. Bye, Mary.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.